Let's talk about what creativity actually is in the brain. Not metaphorically, but biologically. Creativity isn't just about imagination or artistic expression. It's a functional output of how different networks in the brain communicate. And two systems are especially critical here: the default mode network and the executive control network. The default mode network is active when you're not focused on the outside world, when your mind wanders, when you're daydreaming, when you're running mental simulations. This network is where we draw from our internal narrative, our memories, and our ability to generate spontaneous associations between ideas that might not seem related on the surface. It's the system that allows for mental exploration. But creativity doesn't end there. In fact, by itself, the default mode network can lead to disorganized thought or ideas that don't go anywhere. That's where the executive control network steps in. This system is responsible for focus, inhibition, and decision making. It evaluates ideas, chooses which ones to pursue, and suppresses those that don't make sense in a given context. It keeps the chaos of creative ideation structured. Creativity, then, is the dynamic interplay between these two networks. One generates the ideas, the unexpected, the humorous, the absurd. The other applies constraint, filters them, refines them. And what's fascinating is that the most creative individuals, especially in fields like comedy, show heightened connectivity between these networks. Their brains are better at toggling between spontaneous generation and structured analysis. They're able to let their minds wander while staying anchored to task-relevant goals. This toggling isn't random, it's trainable. Through deliberate practice, mindfulness, rest, and even timed exposure to novelty, the brain becomes more efficient at switching between these modes. Creativity, then, is not a lightning bolt. It's a coordinated symphony between two powerful systems, each with its own function, timing, and rhythm. To understand humor from a scientific standpoint, we need to look at how the brain processes prediction and surprise. At its core, humor is a form of cognitive dissonance that gets resolved in an unexpected way. The brain builds an expectation based on language, context, or social cues, and then that expectation is violated in a way that's non-threatening and often clever. This is what we call prediction error. Prediction error isn't just a psychological term. It has a clear biological signature. When the brain anticipates one outcome and experiences something else, there's a spike of neural activity in the ventral striatum, a key part of the brain's reward system. This region is heavily innervated by dopaminergic neurons, and when that prediction error is positive, like when a punchline lands, it triggers a dopamine release. That's why laughter feels good. It's not just emotional, it's neurochemical. This mechanism is similar to what we see in music, gambling, or even learning, but with humor, there's an added layer. The brain not only has to detect the incongruity, but it must also resolve it quickly. That rapid shift from confusion to understanding to pleasure engages multiple systems simultaneously: language centers, emotional circuits, and motor areas that trigger the physical act of laughing. So when someone says a joke is clever, what they're often describing is the brain's ability to process a sharp, unexpected shift and reward itself for resolving that shift in milliseconds. The better the prediction error is timed, and the more surprising the twist, the stronger the dopamine response, especially in the ventral striatum. Humor, then, is not just entertainment, it's a deeply rewarding neurological process that trains the brain to be more adaptable, more socially attuned, and more responsive to nuance. And that's why it's such a powerful tool, not just for connection, but for cognitive development and emotional regulation. Let's look at something fundamental to both creativity and comedy: cognitive flexibility. This is the brain's ability to shift perspectives, adapt to new information, and make connections between ideas that, on the surface, don't seem related. It's what allows someone to pivot mid-thought, reinterpret a situation, or turn a mistake into a punchline. Cognitive flexibility is primarily governed by the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain involved in planning, decision-making, and regulating thought. But this region doesn't function in isolation. Its performance is highly dependent on dopamine tone, the background level of dopamine in the system, especially within the prefrontal networks. Now, dopamine often gets simplified as a pleasure molecule, but that's not quite accurate. Its more critical role is in modulating signal-to-noise ratio in the brain. In the prefrontal cortex, this determines how well we can hold multiple ideas in mind, switch between them, and generate novel solutions. At optimal levels, dopamine promotes a balance, enough focus to stay coherent, but enough openness to explore alternatives. When dopamine is too low, thought becomes rigid and rule-bound. When it's too high, it becomes chaotic and scattered. In comedy, this balance is everything. Great comedians exhibit high levels of cognitive flexibility. They're able to shift narrative angles, adopt multiple points of view, and extract humor from contexts that others might overlook. And because humor often depends on reframing, the ability to see something familiar in a totally unfamiliar way, dopamine-mediated flexibility becomes the neurological engine that makes this possible. So when we talk about innovation or comedic insight, we're really talking about a system that's chemically tuned to toggle between structure and spontaneity. It's not random, it's not magic. It's the precise coordination of neurotransmission in the prefrontal cortex that allows the brain to break its own patterns just enough to create something truly new and to make others laugh in the process. Let's talk about stress, specifically chronic stress, and its impact on creativity and humor. Most people associate stress with emotional discomfort, but at the neural level, the effects are far more widespread and mechanistic. Chronic stress is not just a psychological burden, it's a physiological disruptor of the brain circuits that support flexible, imaginative, and playful thinking. Here's what's happening under the hood. When we're under prolonged stress, the brain and body produce elevated levels of cortisol, the primary stress hormone. Cortisol, in the short term, helps us mobilize energy and sharpen focus. But over time, chronically elevated cortisol impairs the function of the prefrontal cortex, the very region involved in decision-making, working memory, and crucially cognitive flexibility. At the same time, chronic stress downregulates activity in the hippocampus, which plays a role in contextual memory and pattern recognition, two key ingredients in both creativity and comedic timing. It also overactivates the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, which narrows attention and biases the brain toward familiar, survival-oriented responses. That means fewer novel ideas, less divergent thinking, and a reduced capacity to find humor in uncertainty or absurdity. Put simply, stress makes the brain less playful. And humor, at its core, is a form of cognitive play. It requires looseness, the ability to hold multiple interpretations, to embrace ambiguity, and to reframe discomfort. When the nervous system is locked in a survival state, that capacity gets shut down. So if we're trying to access the mental states that allow for sharp comedic insight or deep creative output, managing stress isn't optional, it's foundational. Practices that reduce cortisol, like quality sleep, exercise, social connection, and even structured rest, don't just feel good, they restore the very circuits we rely on for innovation and humor. The brain can't be in defense mode and creative mode at the same time. Let's take a moment to look at sleep. specifically REM sleep, and its powerful role in creativity and comedic insight. REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, is the phase where the brain is most electrically active, almost as active as when we're awake, but the body is largely paralyzed. It's also the stage most strongly associated with vivid dreaming and emotional integration. During REM sleep, something remarkable happens. The brain disengages from the constraints of waking logic and begins to recombine information in novel ways. Neural circuits that typically fire in a structured, goal-directed pattern during the day are freed from those patterns at night. The result is a sort of internal remixing. Memories, concepts, and emotions are deconstructed and reorganized, often in bizarre or surreal ways. What's happening here isn't random. The hippocampus and neocortex engage in a dialogue, with the brain selectively reinforcing associative networks that might not have connected during waking states. This process is what allows for creative leaps, the moment where an idea, a joke, or a metaphor appears to come from nowhere. It's the aftermath of a biological process that reorganizes neural data offline. REM sleep also helps downregulate the emotional tone of memories. That's key for comedians and creatives because it allows a person to revisit emotionally charged experiences without being overwhelmed. In that way, REM sleep creates a buffer. It gives the brain enough emotional distance to reinterpret or find humor in difficult experiences. So when people say they sleep on a problem and wake up with a solution or a fresh take, that's not just anecdotal, it's neurologically real. REM sleep acts like a creative incubator. It breaks the brain out of rigid pathways and enhances the ability to find unexpected connections, the essence of both creativity and humor. It's not a luxury, it's part of the system. There's a tendency to think of creativity and comedy as spontaneous, as if they arrive fully formed in flashes of genius. But when we look at how the brain actually works, what we see is that deliberate repetition and structured practice are what build the neural architecture necessary for consistent performance in these domains. The principle at play here is called experience-dependent plasticity. It means that the brain changes in response to use. When you repeatedly engage in a specific activity, whether it's writing jokes, improvising, or crafting a narrative, you're literally shaping and reinforcing the circuits involved in those tasks. Neurons that fire together wire together, and with enough repetition, those pathways become faster, more efficient, and more reliable. In the case of comedic timing or creative fluency, this involves several systems: language centers in the temporal lobe, motor planning areas in the frontal cortex, and reward circuits like the basal ganglia. These regions begin to synchronize their activity, allowing for rapid retrieval of material, smooth delivery, and the flexibility to adjust in real time depending on the context or the audience's reaction. And there's more. Repetition strengthens myelination, which is the insulation around axons, the wiring of your nervous system. The more myelinated a circuit becomes, the faster and more precise the signal transmission. That's why experienced performers can access ideas or adjust delivery instinctively. It's not just talent, it's the result of thousands of repetitions embedding those circuits deep into the motor and cognitive systems of the brain. What this tells us is that creativity isn't just about coming up with something new. It's about building the mental and physical scaffolding that allows novelty to emerge reliably. Practice doesn't kill creativity, it enables it. It creates a kind of neural readiness that supports spontaneity, making the brain better at navigating the unexpected, which is exactly what comedy and innovation demand. So when we step back and look at the science and art of comedy and creativity, what becomes clear is that these aren't just gifts or random bursts of brilliance. They are the result of specific, trainable brain processes. They rely on the dynamic interplay between neural networks, the precision of neurotransmitter systems, and the structure provided by practice, rest, and emotional resilience. Creativity and humor thrive in the space between order and chaos, between the known and the unexpected. They depend on cognitive flexibility, emotional integration, and a brain that's wired not just for performance, but for adaptability. And with the right inputs, sleep, stress regulation, repetition, and a deep understanding of how the brain functions, these capacities don't just emerge, they grow. Whether on a stage, in a studio, or in everyday problem solving, comedy and creativity represent some of the most powerful expressions of human neurobiology in action. And when we understand the systems behind them, we gain access not just to better performance, but to a deeper, more agile version of ourselves.